Welcome to the sixth video. Welcome to the sixth video of the Introduction to IFS or Internal Family System Theory. In this video, we will focus on this, the self. And we will cover questions like, what is the self? How was the self discovered? And why is it important? At this point in the video series, we've mostly looked at one element of the theory, which is we all have different parts. We've looked at this a lot in depth, checking out what are parts, what are protectors, what are exiles, etc., etc. So for this video, I want to explore the other really important element of internal family system theory, which is we all have a self. We don't just have different parts, healthy parts, extreme parts, exiles, protectors. We also all have a self, a spiritual core we can access during sessions or everyday life. Now that's a pretty big statement to make, and I think for many people new to internal family systems, this is one of the more difficult elements of IFS and the theory to understand, because we are so used to thinking of our personality as having developed this way or as our parts and etc. But then there's suddenly self, which is a completely different thing. So let's maybe explore for a moment, how did self enter this methodology and this theory? So to maybe tell a little story that we've started in the first videos, it's Richard Schwartz discovered parts by working with patients, working with clients, a lot of people with eating disorders, self-harming behavior, etc. And they started to just talk about their inner worlds as parts. There were different parts, they were doing different things, they liked or didn't like each other, etc., etc. And being intrigued by this, he wanted to get to know the different parts. And when there were multiple parts and one part speaking over another, he used a very, very simple family therapy technique, which is asking one part to step aside. This is usually used in families when one family member will speak over all the others, and then they are asked to stand at the back of the room or even leave the room so that the other family members can speak. And he did a very similar thing with parts. So basically, when there were parts blended, and he wanted to get to know one of them, he would ask the part that was really loud or intense if it could step aside. And to his surprise, a lot of parts were willing to step aside. And when they stepped aside, suddenly the inner world changed, where before it was like talking about, oh God, and I have to do this, I need to hurt myself because it's the only way I can feel better. And then when that part steps aside, suddenly there's, oh, I hate it when I do that. I really don't like it. And I want to stop this behavior, because one part stepped aside, another part is still blended. But as he kept on asking different parts to step aside, he discovered that suddenly his clients, his patients would reach a state where they would be talking very differently, where suddenly, rather than being enraged and in extreme behaviors, they would suddenly be talking about, oh yeah, I can understand that. I have compassion with that. I actually want to learn more about that. And Richard Schwartz, having discovered we have different parts, he asked, okay, so which part is that? And the people would say, this is not a part. This is me. Which is a strange statement to make. But as this happened more often and often, he discovered what he has said. He discovered that these patients, these people, were kind of the same person underneath. And one way to maybe look at this is, underneath all the parts, as soon as they step aside, there is something like a healthy adult. There is the self. And when no parts had taken over the self, suddenly the patients had much more mature perspectives, where they could see, rather than extreme options, they could see, oh, there's this perspective, there's that. I can get why this part is worried. I can get why this part doesn't want that. And all of those were okay. And suddenly there were compassionate attitudes towards the parts, compassionate ways of interacting with them or with other people. And all of that came up, was just there in them when the parts stepped aside, and without good parenting. They didn't have to have the attachment foundation intact, because many of these patients didn't. Without having done lots of healing, because it would happen from one moment to the next. It was just there. So the understanding that Richard Schwartz came to and that now underpins all of IFS is there is a self. We all have it. It's right underneath the surface. And when the parts step aside, we can have access to this self with really helpful qualities for therapy, for coaching, but also for life. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. So one way to understand this is that self is the seat of consciousness, which is a slightly difficult term, but maybe let's look at it like that. So we are conscious beings. And usually when we are conscious, we look at things and we are conscious of things. We are thinking about things. We're trying to understand things. But where is that consciousness coming from? That would be the question of the seat of consciousness. And the theory is, or the hypothesis is, it's coming from this self. And when parts blend, we see the world through them. But when they've unblended, we can see the world more through that consciousness, that self. And this seems to have qualities that are very consistent among all sorts of different people, and they seem to be very helpful for dealing with challenges, dealing with stress, dealing with complex situations. So self is that seat of consciousness, and parts can take that over, but at the base of it is the self. So if we look through that lens, self is the seat of consciousness, then we can understand blending and activation from a deeper perspective. So in this case, blending would be when a part takes over the seat of consciousness, meaning that the part takes over the self, and in that moment there is little self available, so we start thinking like the part, seeing like the part, feeling like the part, etc., etc. So this would be blending. On the other hand, what we talked about as activation would be when a part is active, but it doesn't take over the seat of consciousness, or at least it doesn't take over the seat of consciousness completely. So basically an activation would be a situation where a part is present, but there's also self present. And that's a completely different thing, because if there is self present, whatever that means, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, I have wiggle room. I have the possibilities to interact with the world from that self, that seat of consciousness, which I don't have if things are, or parts are, blended, or in the case of exiles, maybe flooding the system. So that's seeing those two concepts through the lens that the seat of consciousness in us is the self. So in short, you could say, whoever is occupying the seat of consciousness in the moment, whether that's a part, another part, or self, which is the natural inhabitant of the seat of consciousness when parts relax, whoever is occupying the seat of consciousness in the moment determines who you think, feel, and act as, meaning it determines your identity in that moment, who you are in the world and how you perceive the world, feel towards the world, etc. And building on that, I want to explore two concepts that IFS uses and that are slightly different but very, very related, which is self and self-energy. So self, in the IFS understanding, is the seat of consciousness. And one way to look at it is that it's the entity, so it's kind of the being that has specific qualities of presence. So if that being is present, if we are connected to that self, the seat of consciousness in us, we will have natural qualities of presence from which we can act, think, do in a way that is not possible when parts have blended so much that we are not connected to self. So that's self, the entity, the seat of consciousness itself. On the other hand, self-energy, which here is visualized by these kind of like flower petals here, self-energy are the attitudes and feelings that self naturally displays towards parts and humans. So if we are connected to self, we will naturally have certain ways of relating, feeling towards, feeling about, and attitudes towards humans and parts. And those attitudes are called self-energy. They are kind of the energy that self naturally displays or exudes towards humans, towards parts, etc. So self is the entity, the seat of consciousness itself. Self-energy are the feelings and attitudes. And what I find most profound about this perspective of we all have a self, we all have the spiritual core right underneath the surface, that as soon as parts step aside, as parts are not blending and taking over the seat of consciousness anymore, it's there, is that this is a spiritual paradigm shift. This can fundamentally change the way we look at therapy, coaching, personal growth, all of those things. Because without a self, the question would only be, how do we heal parts? How do we learn skills? How do we find strategies to deal with situations? And all of those are wonderful. But if there is a self, and if as soon as that self is freed a little bit, there is a power of presence that is fundamentally different from parts, then suddenly there is a completely different question in the room and a completely different way of looking at change and transformation, which is, how do we connect to that self? Not just how do we help the parts, how do we do all of that. All of those are absolutely important as well. But if all of those positive qualities go along with self and self-energy, how do we connect to that? That's a completely new question that is only available if there is such a thing as a self. And it's a question that's very fundamental and central to IFS as an approach. So I'm going to look at that in future videos. I just want to make clear that this is a paradigm shift. And beyond just this paradigm shift of from this place of self or self-energy, we can change and we can help parts and we can deal with situations differently. IFS would actually go one step further and say that self is the natural and capable leader of our inner system. So that self is meant to lead the system. We are meant to lead within our own psyche, our own system from self, this spiritual place, the spiritual core of us. And that when we are connected to it, when this is freed enough, we naturally have the capacities to do it, and that parts actually react very positively to the self. So that's an even deeper perspective of this that I will also explore in the next videos. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If this is helpful for you, please feel free to share it with others, and see you in the next video.
You never know what's around the next corner. So.